But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. In this episode of the History in Motion podcast, we venture into the dark and complex tale of Vlad III, known to history as Vlad the Impaler. Amidst the 15th century chaos of political strife and Ottoman encroachments, Vlad ruled Wallachia with an iron fist, his reign marked by the infamous punitive methods that earned him his chilling moniker. But beyond the blood-curdling legend lies a story of a ruler driven by fierce loyalty to his homeland, employing both diplomacy and savagery in his bid to secure its sovereignty. Today we strip away the layers of myth to examine the true legacy of Vlad the Impaler. Was he merely a tyrant, or can his actions be seen as the desperate measures of a leader in turbulent times? How did his rule shape the destiny of Wallachia and influence the larger historical narrative? Join us as we explore the life of one of history's most enigmatic figures, where history and legend intertwine, revealing a story that continues to fascinate and haunt the world. Welcome to the History in Motion podcast.
Welcome back, everyone. And Ritchie, I think we're pretty excited today to talk about Vlad and all the craziness that kind of comes around him, plus the story of Dracula, plus the connection with Mehmet last week. This is not really something that I thought would intersect as much as it did, because coming into this, we know the story of Dracula and this undead vampire, and you hear about Vlad the Impaler, and hence the name, love to impale people. And you try to look at the two of them, and you try to wonder, how much is influenced by the actual Vlad to get to the Dracula that we know from all the stories that have been told. And you kind of almost look at the character of Dracula, and you think maybe he's almost a little bit better of a person than the actual Vlad in some capacity. But then that changes depending on who you ask. So I think this is going to be a really good one, because it really brings into the fold so many different types of people, and kind of talks about the founding of the nation of Romania that, is still a country today with its own distinct language and cultures and everything like that. And it all kind of comes back to the time of Wallachia and Vlad. So I'm pretty excited to get into this one, but I don't know if you had anything that kind of jumped out to you really early on outside of, hey, this guy liked to impale a person or two.
Yeah, I think if anything, the degree to which he liked impaling probably shocked me. I knew about the impaling. I didn't know about the degree to which he impaled people. I think also it kind of reminded me of a couple of the episodes that we've done before. And I think one is this whole idea of, he is an infamous historical character. And my opinion on that has not changed at all. But where I think there's some nuance to my analysis is that I kept thinking about our buddy Niccolo Machiavelli, about being feared as a ruler, because it seems like in Romanian folklore and national pride, Vlad kind of takes up a very interesting space, because it seems like people really did, or at least historically, see him as this kind of nationalistic hero. But again, depending on who you talk to, and this is why perspective in history is so interesting, is that, he was extremely feared, but in the same vein, also very respected. And, there was this whole thing in my head, this whole dialogue going on while I'm doing the research and I'm watching the videos, where Machiavelli just kind of kept coming out, this whole idea of being a Machiavellian leader. And I'm sure we'll see elements of that. And it's a topic we'll continue to touch on.
Yeah, it's such a great point, and one that I didn't really make the connection with until you kind of mentioned it, but it makes perfect sense, right? Because we'll get into Wallachia as a state, but it's surrounded by these massive empires. Mm-hmm. And to be able to hold control into that place with not just internal struggles, you have so many external factors trying to dictate things in Wallachia to gain influence. And to be a very feared ruler, you're going to definitely help stabilize things internally. But from an external perspective, it can go one of two ways. It can go either that, hey, we're not going to mess with Wallachia because they have this ruler who keeps impaling everybody and we don't want anything to do with that. Or, oh my God, this guy's crazy. We got to get him out of there and put someone in power that we can trust. And so we'll see as we go through Vlad's life how sometimes it kind of works in his favor and sometimes it doesn't. But it really all comes back to, I think, what you said around how Romanians view him from that perspective, because they didn't really have anybody who was kind of looking out for Romanian interests or Wallachian interests in this case. It was, what did the Hungarians want? What did the Byzantines want? What did we'll see the Mongols even show up for a little bit. And what did the Ottomans eventually want? And that's what dictated things in Wallachia outside of when things were strong politically within the state. So you can see that kind of love to say, you know what, this guy was one of us. He stood up for the people that he was defending, despite the fact that he used some very cruel and definitely not by the book methods to get there. But again, if he was reading Machiavelli, which was, it was not too far along to when Machiavelli would write The Prince, you'd almost say, like, yeah, he's kind of following some of that blueprint, maybe going to the cruelty level a little bit higher than Machiavelli would have recommended, but he's definitely taking that, would you rather be loved or feared, to, the highest degree I think you could possibly take.
Yeah, and maybe just a bit of a teaser as we get into it, because I think there's going to be countless stories about his cruelty and his infamy that we talk about throughout the episode. But there was one that really struck out to me, and I think for me it kind of epitomizes this whole Machiavellian trope, which is apparently, in like the city center, he left a gold cup by the well that people could use to fill up water and then, take away. And, the story or the sentiment behind this kind of this parable is that no one stole the gold cup because he was able to keep crime so low and create such a environment of, fear that if you were to steal the cup, what would happen to you would be so horrible that, you're better off just not doing it. And the story goes that that cup was never stolen, ever. And to me, like that sentiment is something that like really kind of just hit it home with, to be a feared ruler and to, in the same vein, create an environment where, people are not willing to steal. Theft is almost non-existent because the what you're going to face if you do is worse beyond your wildest imagination.
That's a fascinating story because you've got this autocratic leader, but also an autocratic regime to, again, a really high degree. It has some great benefits, like no one's going to commit a crime. But I'd be curious to see on the flip side, too, of, free expression. I don't think is something you're going to see much in Wallachia under Vlad. You're not going to see people questioning him or anything like that, at least publicly. And I'd be curious to see, it was one of those things we don't necessarily know for sure, but like in his back room, does he have a few people he really trusts who can tell him how it is? Or is it all a bunch of yes men? And we'll see kind of with some of his successes. And we kind of touched on this last week. We don't know for sure, but you can look at the outcome and you could probably put two and two together and say, yeah, this person had people around them that they could trust and would tell them the right things. And a lot of the times when we see rulers who aren't so strong, we know for sure, and we have reports of them just surrounding themselves with yes men and family members. So I'm sure we'll get into some of that, but maybe I think we should jump into Wallachia a little bit. We've mentioned it a few times, but we're going to do a little bit of an overview first on what the heck is Wallachia anyways? What does it represent? And where did it even come from? Because this is just kind of a state that just kind of pops up, it seems like, out of nowhere, and then exists for maybe about 500-600 years until it eventually amalgamates into the country of Romania, which goes through a few iterations. But when we think of Romania today, that's basically where Wallachia is. The language is very similar, and people who are Romanian definitely think of themselves as Wallachian at one point. So, like I said, it was a state, a principality, a vassal state, and even an empire that existed from 1330 all the way up to 1859, leading to the founding of Romania. So it does take up most of the geographic area of Romania, but there's definitely parts of Bulgaria and even into Greece that were under Wallachian control for a time. But just to keep things simple, just think of Romania today and think of Wallachia, and you'll kind of able to kind of wrap your head around where it exists. So the name Wallachia is actually not something that the Romanian people, the Wallachian people, use themselves. It's actually an external term used by other people outside of Wallachia. The Wallachians themselves actually use the term Terra Romanisca, meaning Romanian country or Romanian land. So the word Romanian was always kind of there. And then they eventually got their way in the late 1800s where they said, okay, we're Romanian. You guys have to actually start calling us by our actual name. And so the term Wallachia actually derives from a word used by many Germanic people and Slavic people to refer to the Romans at this point, or at some point in history, and others of speakers of foreign languages. So people were kind of coming in, hearing people speaking different languages in this region, and it kind of just evolved from that German/Slavic word into the word Wallachia. So that's why it was called Wallachia from an external perspective by people kind of immigrating to that area. So Wallachia itself, really emerged as a distinct entity throughout many, many years of just changing hands and different things. But one of the most important things is it was actually a Roman province for about 150 years. So the province of Dacia or Dacia, depending on your pronunciation, was conquered by the Emperor Trajan in the year 101. And it was kind of part of this huge expansion of the Roman Empire. And when we see the Roman Empire at its peak, that's under Trajan. So this area of Dacia was kind of taken over by the Romans. And then eventually, after a certain amount of time, there was a lot of immigration from Germanic people and Slavic people. And as the Roman Empire started to decline, you had a lot of people such as the Goths, the Huns, and Slavs who were living in that space and kind of changing the dynamic a little bit of the culture, but with having a very heavy Roman influence as well, because you're a province. Plus you had the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire providing influence. And so that really went on for the next 1,000 years with the Byzantine Empire to kind of the south and a little bit to the southeast, the Hungarian Empire to the northwest, and then eventually the Ottoman Empire coming in and kind of taking away that Byzantine land like we talked about last week. And additionally, there was so many Slavic people immigrating from the north and settling in these lands. And so you're starting to get more and more of those influences in the Romanian culture itself. And then something that I teased earlier is there was the Mongol invasion by Genghis Khan gave the political entities around Wallachia a little bit of breathing room, because the Hungarians and the Byzantines and everybody was so preoccupied with this massive horde coming from the east and didn't know how to deal with it. But the Mongols didn't actually invade Wallachia formally or take control of it formally. They kind of left it. And so this was perfect for the people within that state or within that region, I should say, because they were able to kind of deal with things internally, consolidate power, and not have to worry about what the Hungarians or the Byzantines were doing because they were too busy dealing with the Mongols. And so that kind of moved them into a point where they could have a little bit more strength internally. And so the foundation of Wallachia as a principality is traditionally attributed to the early 14th century Basarab the First reign, where he's considered to be their first independent ruler. And so at this time, the Hungarians had kind of treated the area of Wallachia as a vassal state. But Basarab had a victory over King Charles I of Hungary at the Battle of Posada in 1330. And it is seen as this pivotal moment for Wallachian independence. I went into the battle a little bit, and it's, again, there's definitely folklore to this, but I think it was worth talking about because it's this really symbolic victory of a small little nation, group, principality, whatever you want to call it, just, pushing back against this huge empire and really putting his stake in the ground and saying, this is our land. So long story short was, Charles wanted to go into Wallachia to kind of settle some things with Basarab because there was some political infighting and there was tributes going back and forth, and it just wasn't a good political state. His advisors advised him against marching into Wallachia because if you know Romania today, it's a very mountainous region. So it's very tricky to march a big army in there. But Charles, wanted to anyways. So he marched 30,000 troops into Wallachia, got to the Wallachian capital, and he found out that they were gone. They had ran off into the mountains and they were hiding in the mountains somewhere. So Charles says, all right, we're going to go find them. So he starts marching into the mountains. And the story goes that, they found them. Then there was a bunch of negotiating and they agreed, said, hey, we're not going to fight. Let's sign an armistice. we'll march you guys out of the mountains because we know the way, and then we'll give you the shortest route back to Hungary. And since we're on audio, you can see Ritchie smiling. I think he knows where this is going. So when the army entered a ravine they were led there by the Wallachians, they were completely ambushed by only about 10,000 Wallachians versus the 30,000 Hungarians, starting to shoot arrows at them, throwing big rocks at them, a complete disaster for the Hungarians. And the army was defeated in about 2 days. And at this point, Charles, the King of Hungary, gives his royal clothes to basically just a regular soldier or another nobleman who is killed in battle. But Charles is able to slip away in peasant clothes. So people just think he's a regular guy, and eventually is able to slip away and get back to Hungary. But this is a huge victory now that the Wallachians have said, we've defeated the Hungarians. We have legitimacy. We are our own independent nation, and, don't mess with us because, we know these lands better than anybody else. And thus, the Wallachian state is born. So I think you kind of knew where this was going, and I'm sure there's folklore, and this is spun a little bit to be more of a nationalistic element. But it's a very cool story because I always find it funny with you always have these headstrong leaders who are just, we're marching in and we're going to keep going. We're not going to stop until we find what we need. And many times it ends in disaster.
It's interesting because, I had a feeling I knew where that was going. And I think... So I didn't know that story until you just told me it. And there's actually some echoes of that kind of sentiment within Vlad's story, as we'll see. Like, this is a country that historically, as we'll get into kind of his bouts with the Ottomans, he is like severely outnumbered all the time. Like, it's like a 5-to-1 ratio, 4-to-1 ratio of who he's going up against. And it's interesting to hear that story because I think it kind of adds to the mystique and bravery that people kind of associate with his leadership. And obviously, not to discount his cruelty, but overall, like that kind of sentiment, I think, is something that rings true and almost becomes like this underlying layer of why he is probably so renowned and revered in like Romanian folklore, because they're going up against these behemoth countries and armies, and just by virtue of like their familiarity with the region, their ability to kind of use their small strategic forces more effectively against these massive forces is quite incredible.
And they really shouldn't even exist as a state, as you were talking about it, right? Like, how can a little state like that survive against the Byzantines, the Ottomans, and the Hungarians at this point in time? And we know there's a million other things going on, but let's be honest, like, they're a little state, like you said, outnumbered 4-to-1, 5-to-1 every single time. But you're right, there's some sort of extra juice that the Wallachians seem to have. They know their territory very well. They have definitely a strategic advantage in terms of the type of territory that they're protecting. But at the same time, like, all it takes is someone to march in and find a way to take control of that territory. But to be able to kind of hold them off for a few hundred years, I think is quite impressive, because especially at this time when technology is growing at such a rapid rate, to be able to, fend off the Ottoman cannons or, the Hungarian cavalry and their foot soldiers, it's not something that any kingdom's really able to do at this time, let alone one that's kind of sandwiched in between, all these great powers, right? Yeah. And so the thing with Wallachia too is it's a really strategic position. So this is the other thing. It's not like Wallachia is just some little place that people are like, we might as well take it because there's some good territory. It's actually strategically significant, because it lies as this crossroads between a lot of trading routes from the Black Sea, from the east, from the west, coming up from Russia, coming up south from the really rich Byzantine and Greek areas, and then even through the Mediterranean as well. And we talked about how important Constantinople was last week. Romania is just up the way from where Constantinople is. So there's all of these trade routes going through there. And then eventually it becomes this key buffer state between the Christian Hungarians to the north and the Muslim Ottomans to the south. And so it starts to see, like, if Wallachia falls, Christianity may fall. But the Wallachians are smart because they can kind of play off both. They can play They can ally themselves with the Muslims when it makes sense within the Ottoman Empire, or they can work with the Wallachians, or they can even talk to the Romans, like the Roman Catholics in Rome, kind of play off that to kind of help them use these big powers that are around them to kind of help protect themselves. So it's also works, I guess, in that sense as well, as when you can be savvy politically, you can use these powers against each other. So there's a little bit kind of more that happens here with the Wallachians. And really the biggest thing is the role of the Orthodox Christian Church. So it's really playing a key role in the influence of culture, art, and education. It really underscores that kind of independence and cultural identity for them, because they're creating they're not just Christian, they're creating their own Orthodox version of Christianity. So you'll start to see that with a lot of art and architecture that kind of comes through that space. And then, there's some relationships with more Roman Catholic versus Orthodox, and it comes this whole kind of Christian hodgepodge of, what are these states exactly when it comes to religion? But the important thing is they are that buffer state between Christianity and the Islamic world. And so this is when we get to the story of the Ottomans. So there's a reason we're doing this episode right after Mehmet, because it really is a continuation of Mehmet's story. So we will see Mehmet come on the scene sooner rather than later here. But the Wallachians have their first battle with the Ottomans in the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396, where Wallachian forces under the leadership of Mircea the Elder participated alongside a Christian coalition to halt the Ottoman advance into Europe. So this is, that first direct clash where the Wallachians are allied with the Christian side of the world to kind of halt those Ottoman forces moving into Europe. And this is a battle that will continue for hundreds and hundreds of years, where we see the Ottomans come in, they get pushed back, they come in, they get pushed back, and they get all the way to Vienna, which is, again, if you know your geography, is quite a bit of a distance from where Wallachia is. So the fact that they're able to kind of hold them at bay and be part of this resistance is seen throughout Europe as this very noble thing that's being done. But by the early 15th century, the growing power of the Ottoman Empire led to increased pressure on Wallachia. Mircea the Elder managed to retain a degree of independence through, diplomacy, some military resistance. But following his reign, Wallachia became basically a tributary state of the Ottomans. So they were paying gold, soldiers, whatever they needed to keep the Ottomans from invading. This status meant that Wallachia retained internal autonomy. Its rulers were domestically sovereign, but they again had to pay this tribute to the Ottoman Sultan, and sometimes even participate in military campaigns. And then if the Ottomans were like, we're at war with Venice, Wallachia would have to be at war with Venice, no questions asked. So, you're independent. You can govern how you want to charge your taxes and all that kind of stuff. But from a foreign policy perspective, from a, even from, just think of how it shows, right? Like the leader of Wallachia would have to kneel down and kiss the ring of the Ottoman Sultan. So we can kind of see why when we talk about Vlad being this Romanian, person who fought for independence and that kind of stuff, you can start to see why people are starting to see him like that. But before we get into that, we'll get in just a little quick here on where Wallachia is at Vlad's time, and then Ritchie, I think we can bring Vlad onto the scene. So the biggest thing with all of this is when Wallachia seems to have a strong ruler and everything is good domestically, you get this world where they can fend off the people from the outside. They've got their internal affairs figured out. They can look at what's going on outside and they can figure things out. However, Wallachia becomes weakened by conflict between two rival houses, the Dynasty and the Draculeschi. So the Draculeschi are Vlad's family. That's where the term Dracula comes from. So they're faced with this internal and external conflict. Vlad II Dracul reluctantly agreed to pay tributes demanded of him by the Ottoman Empire, despite his affiliation with, and we talked about this earlier, the Order of the Dragon. So this Order of the Dragon is a group of independent noblemen who have agreed to repel the Ottoman invasion of Europe. And, Vlad II is part of this. But as tribute, it's not just gold, it's not just soldiers. There's a really key thing that happens here. He offers his two sons, Vlad III Dracul, which is Vlad the Impaler, the man we're talking about today, and Prince Radu. So they're actually sent to the Ottoman Empire to live in the court, to be educated by the Ottomans, and they grow up alongside Mehmet II.
Yeah.
So this is where I think this story gets really interesting, because we talked last week about Mehmet growing up, taking Constantinople, being this great conqueror. But at the same time, when he's growing up, he has these two boys that he ends up becoming close friends with, who are from this vassal kingdom. And as we can start to see, the bending the knee to the Ottoman Sultan is a thing you have to do as a leader of Wallachia. And, imagine your best friend you've grown up with for years, and there's nothing you can do about it. But one day, publicly, you're going to have to bend down, kiss the ring of one of your best friends, even if behind closed doors you can be very open and honest with them. And then if you have maybe a leader who's a bit more sadistic, maybe slightly psychopathic, a little bit more egotistical, we can see where these situations go. But I think this is so interesting because I don't think we've ever had any two leaders where we've talked about where they're from separate nationalities, separate religions, but grew up together as boys. So I think that's the most interesting part of this story.
Yeah, 100%. I think it adds like this almost Hollywood-esque dramatic flair to this entire narrative because it's such a unique historical event. Like we've done 30 some odd episodes now, and I don't think we've ever had anything even close to this. Nothing even close to this, no. Right? And it's incredible. Like, and it was funny while you were speaking, I just quickly Googled a map of Wallachia, and yeah, like they are totally sandwiched between some powerhouses at this time. And I think it just adds another layer of complexity to this narrative. Like, regardless of, what will unfold as we'll get into it, like Wallachia is in such an interesting geopolitical position, right? Like they have the Black Sea to the east, the Ottomans, the Austrians, Transylvania, Moldavia. They are just sandwiched in between people who are all looking to consolidate their own power or expand it. It is quite remarkable that they are able to remain and contain and maybe to some degree like even expand their own territorial borders with all of these powerhouses surrounding them.
Yeah, and I was just thinking of the map in my head, like, to the north you have the Slavic regions, and for a long time it was typically a place to grab slaves from, and it was fractured kingdoms, but now you have the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth that's on the rise, and then the big bad Russian Empire is a few hundred years away from really being the powerhouse that it is. So again, the fact that it's able to even exist, I think, is just incredible to the people of Wallachia and the ability for them to work those political dynamics, but also be able to be strong militarily. But at the same time, as I'm talking, I'm thinking of Vlad's cruelty and all these sort of things. And you can't justify any of it, but you're almost starting to understand where you're in an almost impossible position. Yeah. You need someone who's going to be a little bit radical. And back in that time, cruelty is the easiest way to be radical, especially when you have ultimate power. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting as we go through his story on, we can start trying to put two and two together. And it's a terrible thing that we do all the time, where we look at someone's life and we know the outcome and we start to point holes and say, see this happen. That's why they were so crazy. When we talked about it with Hitler, right? When we tried to do his kind of upbringing, and I kind of challenged ourselves and the listeners to be like, don't think of something he did as a 12-year-old boy to explain the man that he was in his 40s. It's not the same person. He grew into that person, and there's a lot of things that did happen along the way. But just because he was, said something mean when he was 12 years old doesn't mean he's going to become Adolf Hitler. But it's a tough thing to do because it's so easy. We love to find patterns in human behavior. So I think we'll see with Vlad kind of how this comes together. It's obviously not as well documented as someone like Hitler, but I think there's a little bit of a comparison in the sense of how we look at someone when we know the outcome, we know the madness that kind of comes to their life. And how do we bring that back down to, he was just a boy who was abandoned by his father to go live in, his, and I guess wouldn't say enemy, but, his vassal state's owner, go live in their court, right?
No, I totally agree. I think it's one of the traps of like studying history and doing this podcast, right? And I think we try our best to be the least deterministic that we can, because when you already know what happened, it's very easy to work backwards with an idea or thesis in mind. And, I don't think that's what we're trying to do here. And, I think you just kind of naturally happen to fall into that trap because, again, to your point, like humans are pattern seeking animals. Like we want to create patterns to justify whatever conclusion we've already come up with. And when we're working backwards, it's very, very easy to fall into that trap. But In this case, we'll see that, his life is actually quite extraordinary. So, we can jump into the main focus of this episode, which is, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad the III, or Vlad Dracula. So, just to kind of reemphasize, so this is the 15th century ruler of Wallachia. Obviously, his reign is notable, infamously for his extreme measures against his enemies. We'll get into particular details about how he fought off the Ottoman Empire, but he's also inspired countless tales and legends. And, he's a bit of this, he casts a large shadow throughout history. So he's born in 1431. He dies in 1476. So he lives, to the age of 45. So he's born in 1431 in the Kingdom of Hungary. He was the second son of Vlad II Dracula. His surname Dracula means son of Dracula, which actually is a reference to his father's membership in the Order of the Dragon, which is a chivalric order dedicated to defending Christianity against the Ottoman Empire. So maybe just a little bit about his father. So his father is a pretty pivotal figure in the 15th century. He's embroiled in an ongoing struggle, Paul, to your point, between the Christian kingdoms and the expanding Ottoman Empire. So he is a member of this Order of the Dragon. It really does symbolize his commitment to defending Christianity. And this is a principle that kind of undercuts everything in his life. And it guides his very tumultuous reign as voivode of Wallachia, which voivode is like local ruler or governor. And this is kind of what drives him to navigate a very complex labyrinth of, alliances and enemies. And his leadership, is really marked by the goal to preserve Wallachia's sovereignty amidst the clashing interests of the Ottomans to the south, the Kingdom of Hungary to his north. Again, we see someone who diplomatically is trying to create a very, very delicate balance, including a very, very controversial decision to send his sons, Vlad III, or, Vlad the Impaler, and Radu, his brother, as hostages to the Ottoman Empire. A move which essentially did, secure his throne and Wallachhia's relative autonomy to some degree. He still did have to answer to the Ottomans ultimately, but despite these efforts, Vlad's reign was actually cut short by a betrayal and assassination in 1447, which was orchestrated by the Wallachian boyars and Hungarian forces. Again, I think it just goes to show, to your point, Paul, this is a brutal political landscape. If you slip for 1 second, it's over. Like, you have to be on the ball all the time.
And you even see here as a perfect example, you think, if I'm Vlad II, I've sent my two sons as hostages to the Ottomans. What could be a bigger show of gratitude and loyalty to the Ottomans, and thinking, I don't have to deal with them, but wait a second, if I turn around 180 degrees, there's another massive empire on my doorstep who is not happy that I'm allied with the Ottomans. And, they don't need to invade. All they need to do is find a rival family, find a rival group of people who think that they don't, they want to have their chance at power, or they're looking at what Vlad done by sending his sons away, saying this is a disgrace. And the Hungarians are all too happy to play off this because they just want someone loyal to them, because that creates the buffer, right? Now the Ottomans are held back by an enemy Wallachian state. Well, now it's flipped because the Wallachians are actually not a buffer state. The Ottomans can march through whenever they want to the agreement that they have. So like you said, just brutal and on all facets. I don't really understand how any ruler of Wallachia can have some sort of stability without, going to drastic measures.
Yeah, no, it's such a great point, because if they're not facing internal strife, they're facing external threats. And if they're not facing external threats, they're facing internal conflicts. So it doesn't really seem like there's ever an opportunity to really consolidate and, reorganize, because there's always something going on internally or externally. So before we get into, the hostage situation in the Ottoman Empire for his two sons, he's only 11 when he gets sent over to, as hostage. So, like, in terms of what, your typical pre-11-year-old is doing in Wallachia at this point, it really would be, kind of true of any person who's kind of born into this position. So he's learning the arts of warfare, chivalry, statecraft. Essentially, there's this whole preparation going on to prepare him for a future in leadership in a region that is, again, defined by struggle and encroachment of external threats and a lot of internal conflict with the warring families. But this is where things get very, very interesting. So him and his brother, so Vlad III and his brother Radu, were sent as hostages to the Ottoman Empire in 1442 under the reign of their father, who is Vlad II. And there's a lot of Vlads to keep track of here. The context for this action, it's deeply, again, rooted in the geopolitical struggles of the time. And again, it reflects his father's ambition to maintain a very delicate power between the Christian principalities of Eastern Europe and the rapidly expanding Ottoman Empire. So young Vlad spent his first years together with his family. So when his father refused to support the Ottoman invasion of Transylvania in March 1442, Sultan Murad ordered him to come to Gallipoli to prove his loyalty. He departed together with his sons, Vlad and Radu, and once they arrived, they were all imprisoned. By the end of the year, their father was released, but Vlad and Radu were kept as hostages to secure the loyalty of their father. So essentially, at this time, and this is to some historical debate as to like how they were treated, what their relationships were with Mehmed and Murad, but more or less, we can assume confidently that the two brothers were trained by the Ottoman Empire to become, skilled warriors in the harsh conditions of the very, very demanding Anatolian plateau. The goal essentially was to form these two princes according to their culture. So when the time came for them to rule Wallachia, they wouldn't rebel against the empire, right? They're trying to groom puppet leaders in many ways. So in time, Radu, who came to be known as Radu the Handsome, grew very close to Sultan Mehmed II, with some suggesting that they even had an intimate relationship. On the other hand, Vlad took the extreme opposite route and was profoundly disgusted by the relationship his brother had with Mehmed II. And his time there within the empire, his hate grew exponentially. But he did find refuge in learning about the arts of combat. Thus, he spent most of his time learning about warfare, military tactics, and he became an expert in hand-to-hand combat. Seeing all those years as within the empire, within the walls of the empire, how the Ottomans had destroyed his family, his youth, and how cruel they were in battle, I think was quite formative and determined him to do whatever was possible to become ruler of Wallachia and ensure that he would support in defending, the Christian principalities against the Ottomans and, I guess in his perfect world, even destroying them.
It's interesting because I wonder, like, from the Ottoman perspective, right, we're trying to groom these two young boys into men who can eventually become puppet leaders. But like at some point, there's a personality clash that's going to happen. And we see exactly what you were saying with Vlad, right? How can you expect a person who's been abandoned by his father, hearing stories that his father has now been assassinated and somebody else is in charge? So now there's going to be, if he's even the slightly bit vengeful, he's going to want to come back. But then he's also he wants to bring great honor to his family and to his father's name and all of these sort of things. To see someone like Vlad just go back and be like, all right, I'm in power. I'm, loyal to the Ottomans again. And then we start to see who Vlad becomes and we can start to see some of these personality traits. I understand where the Ottomans are coming from. Like, why wouldn't you try to groom a son of one of the leaders and make them a puppet? But again, it's one of those things where outside of fully invading Wallachia, I don't know if you're ever going to fully have control over it in the way that they need to be.
And this is one of the complexities, right? Like, and in one way, their mission worked extremely successfully, but they may have got the wrong brother, which is
Very
that,
true. Yeah.
right? Like Radu ended up actually converting to Islam and stayed within the empire and even supported Mehmet II in the fall of Constantinople and lived in Istanbul. So, with one brother, it worked almost perfectly. The other brother, on the other hand, had the exact opposite effect.
I guess that's the bonus of taking two brothers. You can roll the dice a little bit more and hope at least one works out, right?
50-50 odds, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
To a certain degree. So he's actually set free in 1447. This is after the death of his father and his elder brother, Mircea, which was a very gruesome detail. Which it's believed that he was actually buried alive. So they find out about their deaths, which obviously influences the decisions of the Ottoman noble families to, put what they would presume is a puppet leader in place to rule Wallachia. But in Vlad's mind, it's probably taking a very different tone. Insofar that I can see him potentially seeing himself as the ruler of Wallachia and promising that he's going to get revenge on these atrocities, not only against the people that assassinated his father and eldest brother, but to take vengeance against the Ottomans for how they broke up his family and how they treated him while he was there, or at least in terms of like a religious context as well. So maybe just to double down on this point for a second, because I thought this was really cool. So we've talked about like the political context, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. The conditions in which they lived. So this is something of like pretty significant historical debate, with some sources suggesting they were treated pretty well in accordance to their royal status. Like these are royal family members. This is nobility. While others hint at a kind of a much harsher treatment. However, it's kind of widely acknowledged that this period, did regardless had a significant impact on Vlad. And I think the big takeaway for me was like it taught him the importance of psychological warfare and the use of terror as a tool of power. Lessons that, as we'll see, he would later apply with like mechanical-like efficiency.
I think that's the perfect way to put it. I was wondering what adjective you're going to go to, and I think mechanical-like efficiency is perfect, because when we start to talk about numbers, it's almost freakishly efficient on how well he's able to be cruel to as many people in a short amount of time.
Yeah. And, obviously the moniker of Vlad the Impaler does kind of invoke feelings and sentiments of like very, very terrifying psychological warfare. So, but after he's released, he essentially has 3 periods of reign. The first is in 1448, very short-lived stint. The next is from 1456 to 1462, and then finally in 1476. So again, fragmented, sporadic, but he is able to gain and regain, control and actually have consolidated reigns for a significant amount of time as a ruler. So his first reign in 1448, its initial ascension to the throne, it was very brief and very tumultuous. So with the support of the Kingdom of Hungary, he made his first attempt to seize power. Very, very short-lived, largely because he was very young and he lacked the military strength and political support to kind of consolidate his rule. The political landscape at the time was dominated by the struggle between, again, the kingdoms of Eastern Europe and the Ottomans. And this, stint is really just a footnote in his overall legacy, where he's able to really consolidate power and have his period of infamy is in his second reign from 1456 to 1462. This is where he carved out his legacy, both literally and figuratively. During this period, he focused on strengthening Wallachia's military and economic standing. He implemented a very strict justice to maintain order, ergo the story about the cup, the golden cup at the well that we kind of started off this episode with, to not only have internal strength and consolidation, but also be able to focus on dealing with the Ottoman threat. And Vlad's campaigns against the Ottomans were, again, characterized by guerrilla tactics and psychological warfare, including his use of impalement as a method of punishment and intimidation. this is what eventually would give him the nickname Vlad the Impaler, and would later contribute to the legend of Dracula, which was a book that came out many I think centuries later.
Yeah, it was
right?
late 1800s. It was I think 1897 it was written. Yeah.
So we're looking 300-400 years after the fact. And maybe this is a pretty gruesome detail around like the impalement thing, but I read that this was his favorite form of punishment, spiking and impalement, and these the things that he to use to impale were not necessarily always sharp or quick and efficient in that sense. Some people would die within a day of the impalement actually slowly working through their bodies, through their organs, by virtue of gravity pulling them down onto this massive spike. And this was like one of his favorite forms of punishment, to show power and bring terror to anyone who would even think about crossing him or any of the rules that he was setting.
Yeah, I even read something about how his executioners got so good at impaling that they would be able to essentially, and then warning, this is quite gruesome, stick something that he's going to impale you with, up the person's rear all the way out through their mouth. But they were so good that they could avoid all the major organs to really prolong the suffering and the death. And I kind of think of crucifixion as a similar form of punishment, but I think almost a lot worse, because the initial pain of, just kind of sliding down this massive spike versus, being laid out in the sun. And again, there's a spectacle to it too, right? Like when we talk about the Romans crucifying, after Spartacus's slave rebellion, they've had miles and miles of crucifixions of all the people that rebelled against them. And it's a very shocking thing to see. And oh my God, I'm not going to mess with these guys. Then we take a look at, impaling rows and rows of people. It sends a message, right? It's got that shock factor that a leader like Vlad is really going for. And I'm sure he's quite sadistic and probably has some joy, I'm sure, out of it, to do it as much as he possibly could.
Well, I think that's some of the folklore too, right? Like the fact that he would, there's, again, much of this is probably folklore or either propaganda to discount his prowess, but there are stories about him drinking people's blood, right, at the dinner table, which, I don't know how you can validate that, but again, it just kind of adds to the mystique and cruelty that he is infamously known for. So if we keep talking, sorry, go ahead, Paul.
I was going to say, so you're telling me he's a vampire then, is what you've told me.
I think it makes sense.
Yeah,
I think it totally makes sense.
All right, we'll lock it in.
Yeah. So if we turn back to the conflict with the Ottomans, essentially it reaches its zenith during the night attack at Targoviste in 1462, where Vlad attempts to assassinate Mehmet II. The assassination attempt does fail. This very daring raid deep into Ottoman territory would lead to what is now called the Forest of the Impaled. So after being found out that there was an attack on Mehmet II, he sends forces into Wallachia. And this is probably, one of the most disturbing stories. So it's in June of 1462. And, the battle again with the Ottomans against Mehmet is, reaching a tipping point. The Turkish army, in response to the assassination attempt, approaches the city of Targoviste, and they essentially had the breath slammed out of them. Essentially, it is a scene from hell. Across roughly 1 mile, 23,000 captives had been impaled in a semicircle. In the intense summer heat, the stench of death alone was unbearable, and except to the birds of prey feasting on the living or the dead, or nesting in older skulls and carcasses.
The fact that it's called a forest just tells you, I think, when you start to put, numbers, 23,000 seems like a lot, but when you think of, a really dense forest, replace every tree with an impaled person. Eerie, terrible, horrendous, doesn't even come close to describing it. And I think the thing that's even worse to this is Mehmet is sent he's sent soldiers have gone missing in raids. He sent diplomats that never came back. And who does he find impaled in this forest? Some of his Ottoman brothers who have been, captured and killed by Vlad. So in terms of psychological warfare, not only is it to say, look, this is what I'm willing to do to people who cross me, who are Wallachian, but, when you send your army into my territory, this is the potential ending that could happen for them. It's not a noble death in battle. It's a very gruesome, slow death at the hands of this type of ruler. And on top of that, too, as messengers, as diplomats, you're expected to have some sort of immunity and some sort of respect, at least amongst royal people. Vlad doesn't care. He's like, I'm here to cause terror and, show my cruelty. If you say the wrong thing to me, even though you're a diplomat and even though you're speaking on behalf of the Sultan, too bad.
Well, there's other stories that kind of fit that narrative perfectly before we get any further. There's a story that Mehmet, prior to this particular event, sends a group of Janissaries, so essentially, like a diplomatic convoy to Wallachia to speak to Vlad, and Vlad tells them to take their turbans off, and the convoy responds like, no, we don't typically do that. This is a part of our, religious attire, and we're not taking it off. He put spikes into their heads. As the story goes, he's like, oh, you don't want to take the turbans off. Okay, well, you're never going to take them off. And he put a spike down through the turban into their skulls because he would not be disrespected in his house.
It's all part of this narrative, right? Of don't mess with me, because I'm not just going to, talk down to you, imprison you, even kill you. I'm going to kill you in the most spectacular way possible to send a message to anybody who's willing to mess with you. And it goes back to, I think that gold cup example is so perfect, because it's just this fear that he's able to generate of, you're not just going to die, you're going to suffer for days and weeks and potentially months in unbelievable agony if you double cross me. So, the world he's coming from, where he's seeing, his father get assassinated and all of these people. And there's even a story I read about, he invited, people to a great feast at a dinner hall, closed the door and lit it on fire. So, and even from what I've read, he's done it to nobles who've double crossed them, but he also did it to like old, sick, poor, blind people.
He hated beggars.
Yeah.
Apparently. Yeah. He would put them there's a story, and I don't know if this is the same story, but that he at one point got a group of beggars together in Wallachia, and he fed them a feast where they could stuff themselves beyond reproach. And then he barricaded them in and then lit the house that wherever they had the feast on fire to burn them all alive.
Wow. Again, I talked about Hitler earlier on, and I was hoping we didn't come to this because it's such a lazy comparison. But to see a group of people as inferior and to go out of your way to make sure that you eradicate them in some sort of cleansing like this.
It's bad.
Yeah, it's really bad. And I even read a story here about when the Turks were attacking, he took a bunch of people with leprosy, tuberculosis, and even the plague. And dressed them in Turkish clothes and sent them into the Turkish camp and said, go mingle with everybody.
Yeah.
Like germ warfare before really germ warfare, I think was even really defined.
He weaponized people that were sick. This is like the earliest thing I've ever read about that would come close to like biological warfare, to send people with like tuberculosis and the bubonic plague into enemy camps.
Yeah, he is thinking on a different level, I think. But again, it's always just, what's the most cruel and sadistic thing I can do? Okay, I'll do that. And I'm sure it catches Mehmet off guard going, hey, he's not expecting to see 20,000 impaled people. But he also isn't, when he's preparing his defenses, he's thinking, okay, they're going to attack from here, and we know the camp is over here, and we need to make sure we have scouts in certain areas, all these things. He's not setting up walls to make sure that 1,000 people with tuberculosis aren't able to just sneak into the camp and start mingling with people, right? So it's, again, another level that he has to deal with.
Yeah, no, it's quite remarkable. So this event that we were talking about, the Forest of the Impaled, that happens in 1462. His second reign ends the same year. So he actually becomes imprisoned by Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary. And the circumstances of his imprisonment are, they're up to historical debate, with some suggesting that Vlad was detained due to just, political machinations of the time that painted him as having betrayed the Christian cause against the Ottomans. Others argue that his imprisonment was due to his excessively brutal methods and the political inconvenience his independent stance posed to Hungary's Hungarian interests in the region. So he spent several years in captivity, during which time, he was kind of moved around to various locations in and around Budapest. However, and to his credit, he is somehow able to secure his release, partly due to the fact that he marries Matthias Corvinus's cousin, and is thereby allowed to align himself more closely with Hungarian interests. And during his time in captivity, he does a total conversion to Catholicism, which many see as a political move to align himself closer with Hungary and broader European Christian interests against the Ottomans. So his release didn't necessarily immediately restore him back into power from Wallachia. Instead, he spent several years involved in Hungarian politics and military campaigns. And it wasn't until 1476, with the support of Stephen the Great of Moldavia, another staunch opponent of the Ottomans and a relative by marriage, that Vlad was able to mount a campaign to reclaim the Wallachian throne. This effort was successful, although briefly, as his third reign was cut short by his death a year later in battle with the Ottomans.
I find it funny when you were talking about how he was imprisoned and then converted to Catholicism, and now everything's okay again. It's his actions, right? It's the most anti-Christian thing you could possibly imagine. But he's fighting against the Ottomans, who are somehow worse than a mass murderer, right? So I just find it funny how the hypocrisy of the time of, you're one of us until you're not, but then when you're not, you can become one of us as long as, our interests make sense, kind of under the guise of, my God is better than your God. So yeah, I find that kind of interesting. But again, it's two big empires, Hungarians and Ottomans, are really dictating where things happen for Vlad. But he is able to kind of have some sort of stability through an unbelievable amount of terror and just indiscriminate violence. Again, I'm not trying to justify it, and we never will.
Of course not. No, that's not what we're doing here.
But I think you can understand it a little bit more just based on all the conversations that we've had around how unstable the region was and how people are ready to stab you in the back at any point in time. I think the only way to really have stability at the time is to be some level of cruel, or to put that level of fear into people, because you're not going to be able to play off both sides politically for very long, especially when interests change. But I think with Vlad, we see him kind of go down that route, and then he probably gets some successes being cruel, and then he just keeps going and keeps going and keeps going until I think it kind of comes to his demise, because people are going to start looking at him as a bit of a madman, and especially from the outside looking in, that we can't stand for having this as our vassal state or anything like that. A man who's impaling all these people.
Well, this is a guy that's shrouded in so much mystery still, right? There are a couple of theories around his death, because most people don't even know how he died. So there's three schools of thought. One, that he was killed in battle against the Ottomans, which seems like a very reasonable explanation. The other is that he was assassinated, possibly by a betrayal by the Wallachian boyars or even the Hungarian allies. And the other, less commonly cited theory, is that he died due to mistaken identity and was killed by his own troops who confused him with the enemy. But as far as I know, according to my research, there isn't really one particular one that historians kind of agree on. Maybe the battle against the Ottomans, but people don't even know where his burial site is.
Interesting. And it makes sense, I guess, dying in battle in all three of those scenarios kind of makes sense just because of the chaos of battle. But yeah, the fact that, again, this was a leader of a state for so long, you think there'd be
a monument,
some sort of burial.
Something, right? Yeah.
Well, I think that actually, that you mentioned that, I have one story that we should get to. But as we're kind of wrapping up on the hour here, I wanted to talk a little bit about the story of Dracula quickly. And the fact that we can't find his body. Does that mean he's roaming the earth as an undead vampire? Some would
Paul,
say yes, some would say
so,
no. Let's maybe talk about that a little bit, because I think this is why we all know Vlad, right? We have to talk about the story of Dracula because, you know, the author Bram Stoker, he knew Vlad's story. He read it and he was fascinated by Vlad. And so there's a few things in history here, and I'm going to kind of go through them, and then we'll talk a little bit about how the story of Dracula comes to be. But there's stories that the name was given. Dracula was actually a name that his father had given him when he was young. And even the name Dracul in Romanian can either mean dragon or devil. And so devil kind of came up a little bit more. So, you know, obviously he wasn't a literal vampire, but there's an account, though, of him bringing, you know, a whole Transylvanian suburb in a winter raid and having the captives impaled, then watching as his men cut off the limbs where he sat at a table and dined. Here we are told that he dipped his bread in blood and he dipped his bread in the blood of victims, since watching blood flow gave him, you know, quote unquote courage. This apparently factual blood drinking would feast into the best-selling pamphlets that spread his legend, you know, throughout his death. So this is little stories that start to come from the legend. There's more where, you know, again, there's more stories of him drinking blood. And then there's even a story where local monks found Vlad's torso. I'm not really sure how they knew it was his torso in a clearing of a forest near Bucharest, and carried it into the crypt on an island. And this act kind of symbolizes this reputation of this, you know, great leader, lost to great battle, but a defender of Christianity. And then by contrast, some Russian observers have seen him as a heretic for turning against Orthodox Christianity, moving more towards Roman Catholicism. And this meant that soon after his death, some suspected his corpse would not rest in his grave. And so now this kind of gives to that early, you know, thought of, hey, he's an undead person who's kind of roaming the earth. He hasn't really, you know, settled. And so the question is, did Bram Stoker just read the story of Vlad and say, perfect, this is a story and I'm going to fictionalize it a little bit? So we know that Bram Stoker, who was an Irish novelist in 1897, wrote Dracula. He knew Vlad's story. He liked the name. He liked the setting. He liked all of that. But unfortunately, that's kind of where it ends. So we talked about all of these stories about drinking blood and all these things. And it's kind of why I teased it at the beginning of our podcast today on, we try to fit these narratives. And so people have gone back through history and said, look, there's an example of this, you know, vampire type trope. But Bram Stoker really didn't take a lot of those things and think that he was a vampire. He understood him for his cruelty and that sort of things. And for those who have studied Bram and looked at his writings and all these different things, he's influenced by many different texts, many different mythologies and factors in his life. He's actually more influenced by novels and stories that were written around that time that he was really fond of, authors that he knew that were writing about undead people coming back to life and all of these different stories. And I'm sure there's some influence into maybe a little bit into the vampire side, but to say that Bram Stoker just wrote the story of Vlad and kind of changed it up and made it a little bit more supernatural is unfortunately a little bit short-sighted. So it isn't as interesting as I would have liked. I would have loved to say, yeah, he saw this and turned it into this whole story of Dracula. But it was more just, it was one part of 5 or 6 very large things that influenced, you know, this really incredible story of Dracula. So, you know, we can definitely say, and you'll see everywhere people saying, you know, Vlad the Impaler, the real Dracula.
Oh, yeah.
Sure, you know, sure, you can say that, but I don't even think Bram Stoker would agree with you that there was a real Dracula. I think he was an inspiration. The real Dracula is a fictional character and a really great villain, but nothing more than that.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to do the analysis. And I think even with that in mind, right, it's an interesting reality that, you know, Bram Stoker has created this fictional work that is very enduring still, right? Like, it is still one of the classics. If you go to your local Indigo or where books are sold near you, and you have those classic books, you will definitely see a copy of Dracula at some point. And, you know, to me at least, it kind of solidifies Vlad's rule and historical significance because of his motivation, of how he was able to kind of, cement his legacy insofar that it would actually lead to the creation of one of the most classic books ever written that people still talk about today. And I think, to me, it's cool because, if you've heard of Dracula, you've unintentionally have heard of Vlad the Impaler. And I think, it is a testament to his infamy and his insanely cruel leadership and military tactics, which kind of defined his legacy.
For sure. And I think we have to thank Bram Stoker for writing this novel, because for a lot of us, right, like Vlad may have fallen into certain parts of history with other madmen and crazy leaders over the time. Yep. But when we really look at him, take away any of the folklore and all of that, he plays such a key role in the Islamic kind of Christian battle that's happening, and plays a key role in the lives of one of the most important sultans, maybe in all of Ottoman history. So, he's not just a footnote, I think, where he may have been if, we didn't have this story. So I think, it's unfortunate that people just say, oh, he's a real, basically as close to being a vampire as he could be without, minus the supernatural stuff.
Yeah.
But I think it is interesting how fiction and pop culture and all of these sort of things around historical figures can create this kind of narrative around them and this kind of legacy that wouldn't exist otherwise. And then people like us get to dig in and say, hey, was he actually as close to a vampire as you can be without being a supernatural being? It's an interesting way to start a conversation. And I think, we're thankful for it because it makes these podcasts a little bit more interesting. But I think, Vlad definitely deserves to stand on his own as without this story. But I think bringing the two together creates, something really, really unique and interesting.
It's a very unique legacy, right? There's very few historical figures that would have that, as a part of their legacy, have a fictional book that has endured as long as Dracula has. And I think, for better or for worse, probably for worse, to be totally transparent, it really does go to show like the impact his brutal approach did have historically, that it could be encapsulated in this work that people still read today.
For sure. It's like, I'm sure Bram's not reading his story and being like, oh, he was just a guy. And,
no.
He has a cool name. Like, I'm sure some of the cruelty and stuff said, there's something here. And maybe this is a narrative I can craft. And, we really don't see that a lot with really many other characters or people throughout history. So yeah, it works. I guess it works in Vlad's favor in the sense that we're still talking about him, but maybe not for the right reasons all the time.
Yeah,
but it's an interesting kind of end to his life and to kind of his legacy. And we get to talk about Mehmet again as well and see him, come in and take Wallachia on his quest of really conquering all of the Balkans. So a nice kind of tie into last week. And I'm sure we'll see Mehmet come on the scene, more and more as we dive into things, because he always seems to have a hand in everything that's going on throughout the, the 14th century and 15th century.
Yep.
Awesome. All right. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode, and thank you all for watching, or for listening, I should say.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.